Man, we got a tall order tonight. 33 through 35 in an hour and a half. It's going to be daunting, but it's, yeah. Keep them rabbit trails tight. Yeah. It's going to be needful, though, because when we get from 32 chapter 30, what's that? Oh, yeah, it's going to be a long night tonight. Long night tonight. We get to chapter 36, all the way up through 39. It's one big, huge, connected historical block. So it would be kind of nonsensical to just do one chapter one night if we didn't have to and whatnot. So anyway, this is how we're going to divide it up. But just to make sure we're all trying to keep the balloons together, we know that 1 through 12 is a
microcosm
for the whole book. There we go, man. I'm glad somebody.
You can go now.
Yeah. Got his one answer out. And then 13 through 23 helps us understand how the Lord is systematically dismantling each of these nations that surround Judah and Israel, and to show them that ultimately they must lean on Him. He is their rock. He is their refuge. And then we expand beyond that from 24 through 27, taking this concept, but now applying it on a more cosmic level, seeing that God is leveling the whole landscape to where there's nothing left except for the city that He is going to build in the end. Not a top hat, a city. But we're not going to draw more on that, right? And then from this, of course, we're seeing the divergence of the two different paths. A true Israel and a false Israel. The people who are going to come and actually fall in line with the plan that God is casting here for the future beyond this age of empires, which of course is transcendent even now to the time that we live in. This is the plan that Isaiah is casting, that many of the prophets are going to be tacking on their oracles with respect to what he's saying, helping us better understand how God is going to bring the rest of the nations into this plan that He has been using Israel for nearly the last almost 700 years at this point, and will limp on for another couple hundred years until eventually they are almost annihilated through conquest and exile. And then from 28 to 33, we've got another large section of chapters in which we're looking at various other oracles that are geared more toward, well, the prophetic landscape as goes. Well, we'll revisit some of that here, what we're looking at tonight. And then where we've been messing around from 34 all the way up until this block right here with respect to God looking at trouncing, that's what I was trying to say, trouncing the wisdom of the unwise and looking at the plans of Judah and their schemes to try to reach out to Egypt and in one final power play to get them to side with them to try to fend off Assyria. And ultimately God is going to undermine every one of those plans, showing that, again, this concept here, Egypt is no good and He is the one they must be trusting in. So, with that in mind, let's jump on in here to 33. So we're going to read the first 7 verses. So woe, you destroyer, never destroyed, you traitor, never betrayed. When you finish destroying, you will be destroyed. When you have finished betraying, they will betray you. Yep. Lord, be gracious to us. We wait for you. Be our strength every morning and our salvation in time of trouble. The peoples flee at the thunderous noise. The nations scatter when you rise in your majesty. Your spoil will be gathered as locusts are gathered. People will swarm over it like an infestation of locusts. The Lord is exalted, for He dwells on high. He has filled Zion with justice and righteousness. There will be times of security for you, a storehouse of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is Zion's treasure. Listen, their warriors cry loudly in the streets. The messengers of peace weep bitterly. Odd breaking point, but felt it was probably enough verses to try to fit on this page. But we will carry this concept over to the next one. But digging in, we notice this is the 7th, if you've been keeping track, 7th woe in this second series of woes. So after this, we can expect that he's going to dispense with continuing on with the woe oracles. But remember, every time we've seen the use of this formula, either in chapters 13 through 23, or now roughly 28 all the way up through 33, every one of these are meant to cast a death sentence onto those who are the subject, the referent of God's point of judgment here. Now, when he starts using this enigmatic talk here, when you finish destroying, you will be destroyed. Remember the subject of what we were talking about last week. Judah has been in the center point of God's target here, that he has spoken very openly, very plainly about how he intends to judge them. Namely, because of the fact that they have unwisely taken counsel amongst themselves to carve out an Egyptian alliance without coming to him, a covering, if you will, rather than trusting in him as their layer of protection, their covering, right? And of course, them taking refuge in Egypt is only going to bring them shame and humiliation. But the question now is whether or not we are continuing on with that motif of Judah being the one who is destroying, and when it's all said and done, they will be destroyed. When they finish betraying, they will betray. If that's the case, then the question has to be asked and hopefully answered, who are they destroying? Who are they betraying? But remember, the backdrop, the historical backdrop of this sequence is the fact that Judah is waiting anxiously for Assyria to come. And when Assyria comes, obviously they are well endowed to do great devastation, if not completely annihilate this tiny little kingdom, who at this point has virtually no allies who can help them in the region. So between Judah and Assyria, who really seems to be the one to fit the bill of being able to, let's just talk number one about destroying, Judah or Assyria? Assyria. Who would then stand poised to be able to betray? Knowing what we do about the historical scenario between Judah and their interface with Assyria, and extrapolating the little bit of information we can from Isaiah, but other texts as well in the Bible, knowing what Judah's king, Hezekiah, is going to attempt to try to do, and we've covered this, I won't say extensively, but at least very well in the last 5 chapters of material that we've covered, that Hezekiah is going to rebel against his Assyrian overlord. Remember, because of the workings of his father Ahaz, Judah is really not an independent sovereign state anymore. They are paying tribute to Assyria, and Hezekiah chooses to rebel against that. And in 2 Kings 17 and 18, we get the rundown of what happens. Sennacherib obviously takes grave offense at that, and he comes to town to collect what's rightly his due. So Hezekiah is attempting to try to push away. One could see that as an act of betrayal, but this story actually goes deeper. And it seems like these two actions are hand in hand. Not that Assyria is the one destroying, but Judah is the one betraying. So if Assyria is firmly the one we see as destroying, they're probably the one betraying. And so we've established then who's betraying, what setting this is, but to make sure we've firmly connected this with biblical text, let's read from 2 Kings 18. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Assyria's king Sennacherib attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. So King Hezekiah of Judah sent word to the king of Assyria at Lachish and said, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. What has he done? He has rebelled and stated he doesn't want to pay tribute anymore. So Sennacherib comes. He lays siege to all of these towns. He is systematically destroying them all. Lachish is very close, almost directly due south of Jerusalem, not by that many miles. And to send emissaries to him and say, I've done wrong, please forgive me, he's obviously relenting. He says, whatever you demand from me, I will pay. So the king of Assyria demanded 11 tons of silver and 1 ton of gold from King Hezekiah of Judah. So Hezekiah gave him all the silver he found in the Lord's temple and the treasuries of the king's palace. He strips the gold off the doors. He sends, as you can see, massive amounts of tribute. Now, at this point, Sennacherib packs up his belongings, his army, and he goes back home, right? No, of course not. We read on. Then the king of Assyria sent the field marshal, the chief of staff, and his royal spokesman, along with a massive army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. And this is where we get those 3 particular emissaries of the king addressing all of the king's court and the men who are on the walls looking down, listening in when they are telling them, this is what's going to happen. We're going to come. We're going to attack. Every other kingdom we've ever taken in, we've taken by force. None of their gods have stopped us. Don't think that your God is going to stop us. After all, Hezekiah is the one saying, don't worship him, right? He's dismantled all of his altars, twisting the truth and whatnot. So there wasn't a reprieve granted by the king. But apparently Hezekiah must have thought that if he gives this massive amount of tribute, that Sennacherib is going to go home and leave him alone. He just came, made the big show of force. Hezekiah backs off. I did wrong. I relent. Please take the money, and we'll work this out some other way. Sennacherib takes the money and then still comes and attacks. So what would you call that act? To give this pretense that if you give me what's rightly mine, I'll leave you alone, but then go right after that act and just go punch you right in the face. That's betrayal. It's exactly right. But here we have forecast the doom of the one who is destroying and betraying. When they're done with these acts, the very same thing will happen to them. So we know that after this conflagration ends with the angel of the Lord showing up, killing almost 200,000 soldiers, when Sennacherib brings his army to Jerusalem, and he goes home licking his wounds, that his own sons, in an act of desperate betrayal, will assassinate him in his own temple, worshiping his God. And then after this, historians all agree, Assyria begins a long, slow, methodical, until roughly the last few emperors, and then it accelerates greatly, but a period of decline. They'll never hold the might and power that they have under Tiglath-Pileser III, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, and now Sennacherib. He's pretty much their last great king. And then eventually they'll be taken over by the Babylonians. So this is the framework that we're working in now. We're kind of moving away from the judgment on Judah and once again putting Assyria right in the mix of this. Now remember, let's take a step back for a second. These last 5 chapters and these 3 chapters we're working with is all ramping up to what's going to come in that chapter 36 through 39 block, where we take a big chunk right out of Kings, tweak it a little bit, but look at it for what it is, the fulfillment of all of these oracles and prophecies that Isaiah has been giving about the doom that Assyria was going to bring, and then the doom that God is going to pour out on them after he's done using them for this purpose. So when he says, Lord, be gracious, we wait on you, this kind of invokes some of the language that we've already heard. We go back to previous oracles and we'll see him invoking these prayers, talking about God, or him waiting in the path for God to show up and to give his salvation. So this, in a sense, becomes a refrain that we've already seen employed by Isaiah, but it will come about many places over throughout other corpus or parts of the corpus of Scripture. Namely, we look at Psalm 46, 7, 8, Psalm 74, 83, various other psalms like that are all written, at least the scholarly consensus is, during the exilic period. And many of them operate along this line where you see phrases like, God is our refuge and strength. Isaiah here has just invoked God as being their strength that's renewed every morning. A helper who is always found in times of trouble. Though that formula is not used by Isaiah, nonetheless, he is repeating the idea that God has always been and will always be their salvation in a time of trouble. So why is this important? Because if Isaiah is the one speaking these words more than a century before exile begins, but it inspires so many psalms and much of the hymnody that Israel is going to continue to use over and again throughout the period of exile, considering what they've went through and the promises that God has already made of what he's going to do, this is them looking forward in faith, using the words of this prophet to then put in song what they anticipate, what they feel and believe and hope and trust will happen in their future. Now, talking about the peoples fleeing at the thunderous noise, the nations scattering when you rise, we know that peoples, nations, synonymous terms one for another. But thinking about the backdrop, Assyria and Judah here, and Assyria seems to be the one on the chopping block, the point of focus for the time being then the phrases peoples and the nations would more likely target who? Assyria or everybody? Now, this is the difficult thing for us when it comes to trying to study this, because this is oftentimes where people will start to create divergences in their own sense of eschatology, because it's easy to, at this point, just step on the gas and run right to the terminal end of this is the cosmic picture of God bringing justice and wrath on all of creation in the final great and notable day of the Lord, because we have this formula of peoples fleeing at the thunderous noise, apparently, when God rises in his majesty, and now the nations at large are going to scatter. But we have to remember the context. This fits in the framework of what Assyria is doing. Because remember, Assyria as a nation has always been their own sovereign people, but once they decided to become an empire, they began to swallow up kingdoms. They hold power and sway over many peoples who were once their own sovereign city-state kingdoms that are now completely loyal and in every way subject to the whims of Assyria, probably with Assyrian overlords ruling directly over them in their provinces, or Assyrian sympathizers who are native to their land and who will do everything the Assyrians say just to stay in power. So, perhaps instead of projecting this broadly to all nations and instead just looking at it as a conglomerate of nations under Assyrian control, it keeps this in the framework of what we're talking about. So if the backdrop seems to be the Assyrian advance against Jerusalem, then what do we make of this idea of peoples fleeing at the thunderous noise, the nations scattering when God rises up in his majesty? Think of the story of Assyria coming to Jerusalem to do that dirty deed of destroying them. What do we make of this scenery of them getting scared and running away? When does that happen? In what way does that happen? It's okay, we can cheat a little bit from the story. Right, so they got them surrounded. I mean, victory is all but assured at this point. There's nothing that Judah can possibly do. They have all been, or all the cities have been defeated. Jerusalem is the last and final stop. There is no army to come to save the day. Everybody goes to bed, assuming tomorrow the campaign begins. Everybody wakes up. Hundreds of thousands of people around them are all dead. Now, we don't have this picture of them running away in fright and terror, but you have to know that quite a bit of fright and terror must have filled the ranks, that no man probably had the will or tenacity to want to stand and fight that day. So then he goes on talking about the spoil being gathered as locusts are gathered. And again, we can picture the idea of that army of dead men out there with all of the weapons and everything that they've carried with them, and now their bodies are being plundered perhaps by those who have been shut up inside the city for some time. The Lord, he's exalted on high, and that becomes a reminder then of not only the present truth that has always been, but the eschatological goal. So the defeat of Assyria is not going to really change a whole awful lot in the acute sense, as goes Judah and the interworkings within the city. Hezekiah will die. He will wind up being replaced by a son, Amon, who won't rule that long, and then Manasseh, who is going to extend a 55-year period of almost never-ending, ceaseless apostasy that's going to all but seal the doom of this place. But what this does do is project far into the future, that day that Isaiah has been talking about endlessly in every one of these frames and story panels over and again, that when that day comes, this is the idea. God is going to dwell on high. He will be exalted by his people. And of course, he is going to go on to fill his city with justice and righteousness. It's a promise that there will be times of security, and a picture of it, the city itself being a storehouse of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge. So where have we seen this formula of wisdom, knowledge, righteousness, and justice all coming together in one clear picture? There's the garden, okay. What's that?
Temple.
A temple, okay. How so?
During the justice of sin through sacrifice, the emboldened with God there together. I think that's what's the intent is begin with the beginning.
Right, right. I won't argue with you and say you're wrong by no means. I mean, I think in some way that concept can obviously be connected to what I think is supposed to be a clear allusion back to the Messianic promise, jumping off the page in Isaiah 11. And when I say jumping off the page, I mean it's just sentence after sentence of what we find in the opening verses, that the Spirit of the Lord will rest on this one, this branch that's going to come from the stump of Jesse, in the spirit of wisdom, understanding, a spirit of counsel, strength, knowledge, fear of the Lord. And I don't have room on the slide to enumerate all of it, but it goes on to say that righteousness and justice will be a belt around his waist. So all of this sandwiched together very neatly in this one person. So what we're seeing here is a forecasted picture of, at some point, the anticipated arrival of Messiah to be the ultimate deliverer of Zion from her greatest and most terrible of threats. And it's not the Assyrian captors that are lurking at their doors. It's the sin that continues to keep their hearts captive and hardened against God that refuses to allow them the freedom necessary to be able to finally respond in faith since the days that God called them out of Egypt. Now, the fear of Zion, the fear of the Lord is Zion's treasures. But we go to verse 7. Listen, their warriors, they cried loudly in the street. Their warriors attaches to Zion. Zion's warriors are crying loudly in the streets. Their messengers of peace weep bitterly. The word picture here is not an optimistic one by no means, is it? But again, as we continue to march forward with this picture of Assyrian threatened dominance over Jerusalem, that makes sense. We have a picture of hundreds of thousands of soldiers outside like bloodthirsty wolves just ready to come and conquer this city. Now reading verses 8 through 13, the highways are deserted, travel has ceased, an agreement has been broken, cities despised, and human life disregarded. The land mourns and withers, Lebanon is ashamed and wilted, Sharon is like a desert, Bashan and Carmel shake off their leaves. Now I will rise up, says the Lord. Now I will lift myself up. Now I will be exalted. You will conceive chaff. You will give birth to stubble. Your breath is fire that will consume you. The peoples will be burned to ashes, like thorns cut down and burned in the fire. You who are far off, hear what I have done. You who are near, know my strength. So speaking of the highways being deserted, again, go back to the picture in your mind. Assyria waiting outside on the plains, getting ready to come and just tear Jerusalem apart. So what bearing does that have on the idea of highways being deserted and travel ceasing? Right. I mean, who would be traveling the road at this point? Nobody's going to be coming to the city. Anybody that was going to find and seek refuge in the city has already done so. Everybody else is either scattered beyond Israel's borders and are seeking refuge somewhere else, or probably have already been put to the sword. An agreement has been broken. What do we make of that? What agreement are we talking about? And better yet, on top of that, who is the one who is despising both city and human life?
They broke their agreement with the Lord,
Okay.
but then they also broke their agreement with Syria.
Okay. So in some way, we're arguing that maybe this could very well be Judah, the people of the Lord, who have broken their agreement, their covenant arrangement with him to honor him. In a sense, if we were to take this verse on the surface, isolated away from everybody else, that would work 10 times over. Absolutely no problem. However, this is the tricky thing, right? When it comes to trying to keep this stuff straight. And one of the reasons why we all seemingly struggle so much when we're reading through Isaiah, because it's like, it seems that things just switch so easily back and forth from one concept to another concept. How do I know who's the one or the people or the subject that's actually at the center of this? And I'm still talking about what we were 4 verses before versus now. But if at the beginning of this verse, the highways are deserted because Assyria has come to town, an agreement has been broken, it would seem then Assyria is the one who has made some sort of agreement. And of course, Bobby's right to say that the agreement that Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, has made has now been broken, trust violated by his act of rebellion. So at least 2 of those concepts are being wrapped together in this, perhaps. That Assyria, whatever overture Sennacherib made in saying that, yeah, just give me what's mine and I'll leave you alone, though that's not written anywhere, that's the assumption made. And yet he double crosses Hezekiah. He takes the tribute and still comes anyway to claim what he wants, and that's all of this kingdom now. It's well beyond the phase of just paying the just reparations. And of course, despising and disregarding both city and human life. Remember, Jerusalem is the final prize. How many cities so far has he destroyed up to this point when he comes to take both Jerusalem and Hezekiah? 46. 46 cities have been demolished. Even though it seems like Hezekiah is going to Sennacherib at Lachish because that's where Sennacherib has attacked first. That's the last battle campaign of Sennacherib before he comes to Jerusalem. He's already decimated all the rest of the towns. So it's been a systematic wave of city after city, village after village falling. And Sennacherib has sent these emissaries ahead of him while he wraps up the siege of Lachish before he comes to do what he intends to do in Jerusalem. So just re-quoting 2 Kings 18 to remind us. It's Sennacherib breaking this deal with Hezekiah. The land mourning and withering. You see the pictures of these areas like Lebanon, Sharon, Bashan, Carmel, places that in various books, especially the Psalter, continue to be referenced over and again as areas where life is thriving. These are garden-like atmospheres. The cedars of Lebanon, the oaks of Bashan. Sharon is the place where the lilies are noted to be all over because of the one who is considered to be the lily of the valley, or a lily like that of Sharon in the Song of Songs, right? So for these pictures to be inverted, and now for all of them to look like dead, dying, and decomposing gardens, is to give a very opulent and clear picture of the devastation that Assyria has wrought in Judah, and how the land around what was once the great territory of Israel has become completely decimated and ashamed of what's going on. We've seen that already in Isaiah 24. In Isaiah 24, the earth mourns and withers. This is one of those chapters that we have Isaiah speaking about the cosmic measure of justice, that when God brings judgment and wrath upon the whole earth, this is what it will look like. The greenery of this blue marble that surrounds or circles this star is going to look like a desert landscape as the world just wastes away and withers. Or Isaiah 29, when he asks the question, hey, a little while from now, Lebanon is going to be like an orchard, right? And the orchard, a forest. And now he's taking that picture 3 chapters later, and he's totally inverting it on its head and saying, because of Assyria, it's going to become a hellscape. But after all of this, God says he's going to rise up, he's going to lift himself up, and he's going to be exalted. So who is he going to rise up against? Who's he going to lift himself up against? Before whom will he be exalted? Exactly. He's going to be exalted through them, but he will also be exalted before them as well. Is that not the reason why God is choosing to save his people? Just like so many of these other stories in Scripture where he says, and then you will know that I am the Lord your God. Now this is interesting for him to go on and say, you'll conceive chaff, give birth to stubble. Your breath is fire that will consume you. The you can double as both Judah and Assyria. So I'll take that out of the way for you, but help me work that out. Explain to me how this could be seen as Assyria, them conceiving chaff and giving birth to stubble. What is the chaff?
In a way, you destroy both Syria and Judah by destroying everything around you.
Okay, so in a way you're taking this as a literal picture in the end of God destroying all the vegetation around so that neither of these two peoples can live off the barrenness of what's left behind. But it seems like when he's talking about conceiving, this is obviously that birth language of actually conceiving life in the womb, but instead of giving birth to child, it's chaff. It's the useless part of what comes from the threshing of grain. It's the thing that's fit for only the wind to carry away because it's literally as useless as dust. So what has Assyria conceived then that has now become tantamount and equal to chaff? What are they aspiring to do? Okay. So it's continuation of its imperial ambitions. That's part of it, which now seeks to swallow up Judah. So the plan that's been matriculated so far to destroy them is seemingly going to come to naught. Because when it's all said and done, do they go home with the ultimate prize of Judah? No, they fall short. Same can be said for the extra or extension of this, giving birth to stubble. But what can we say then with respect to their breath becoming fire that will consume them? Well, you think of chaff and stubble, right? These things are wet or dry? Dry. Exactly. So to think that your breath can be combustible enough, that these things blowing around your face, because you got to get that picture in your mind, shovel in, waving the fan up in the air, chaff blowing away. You know what it's like when you're sawing wood or something like that? Dust gets all over you. You got to shake that stuff or pat that stuff off of you when you're finally done. To think that that stuff clinging close to you could now be set on fire just by you doing something so innocent as speaking. This is to talk about how volatile the situation is going to be when Assyria comes against Jerusalem and how God is going to bring his wrath out of the city against them. But now let's double this over. How does this apply to Judah? How has Judah conceived chaff, given birth to stubble, and they be consumed by their own breath that's fire? In the chapters that led up to this, what has Judah conspired to do?
Go to Egypt,
Mhm.
leave,
So does Egypt come up to their back door? Are they the big dog barking behind the little pup and saying, yeah, we got your back, and Assyria gets scared and runs away? No. So did their plans ever come to fruition? No. And Judah in the end, yeah, Assyria leaves. But considering the fact that all of your major important cities throughout the entire kingdom have just been annihilated, and everybody who left and survived those are all refugees in your city, yeah, you can go back and you can patch up walls, but what about all the wealth of your kingdom? It's gone. How do you rebuild after something like this? So their plans have not only been doubled over and torn apart by the Lord, but now he has left them gravely weakened and hugely vulnerable, right? And we can see this left in what we've read already in Isaiah 29, when he's talked to those very things about them going to great lengths to make hide their plans from the Lord. He's called them rebellious children because they try to carry out a plan that's not his, right? So remembering the context of what we've already seen and let that feed into what we're discussing now. Now it gets quite ominous. The peoples being burned to ashes. So we could continue on with the consistency from 8 through 13 as only a picture of Assyria, even though we find a few places where we might be able to see Judah working here too. But obviously the peoples here would not specifically apply to Judah because they are God's covenant people. This is a term that's always euphemistically used of the Gentiles, those who dwell in darkness and are not part of God's covenant family. But to say the peoples will be burned to ashes, like thorns cut down in a fire. You who are far off. Sometimes you get the added phrase thrown in there too of the coasts and islands being literally the farthest reach of the expanse of God's known creative order. That those people who inhabit those isles and byways are all to give ear and listen to what God says. So you who are far off, hear what I have done. Hear what I have done in annihilating Assyria and humbling tiny little Judah. It seems like what we're getting here is something of a bit of a cosmic picture. Now, again, we're somewhat guarded against that, right? Instead of just letting this carry us from the historical scenario of Assyria coming to fight Judah to now jumping all the way to the end of time and speaking of this as being the great final notable day of the Lord, and that's seen in the backdrop or against the backdrop of the Judah-Assyria conflict. Maybe it's meant to be seen as a cosmic picture, but we should caution ourselves first to see this as what's going on here in this particular scenario. And what Isaiah is casting a picture of is, even though the end of his visions in Isaiah 66 gives us a picture of the end of the age, when all the nations are part of the rubble heap here and God is building his city on top of that. Maybe this is a seedling for that, but we have to be cautious, not just let one verse speak to that end alone. We watch it continue to fruesce and grow. If it's a seed, it should start to blossom fruit as we continue to work through the rest of the vast expanse of what's left of Isaiah's works. So 14 through 20. So the sinners in Zion are afraid. Trembling seizes the ungodly. Who among us can dwell with a consuming fire, they ask? Who among us can dwell with ever-burning flames? The one who lives righteously and speaks rightly, who refuses profit from extortion, whose hand never takes a bribe, who stops his ears from listening to murderous plots, shuts his eyes against evil schemes. He will dwell on the heights. His refuge will be the rocky fortresses, his food provided, his water assured. Your eyes will see the king in his beauty. You will see a vast land. Your mind will meditate on the past terror. But you will ask, where is the accountant? Where is the tribute collector? Where is the one who spied out our defenses? You will no longer see the barbarians, a people whose speech is difficult to comprehend and stammer in a language that's not understood. But look at Zion, the city of our festival times. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, a peaceful pasture, a tent that does not wander. Its tent pegs will not be pulled up, nor will any of its cords be loosened. All right, so sinners in Zion afraid, asking these questions. First of all, if we're considering there's a consuming fire and ever-burning flames in their presence, dwelling with them, who or what is that? That's God, exactly. So in what we just looked at in the previous stanzas, the verses that literally came right before this, God's saying, now I will rise up. Now I will lift myself up. Now I will be exalted. it seems like in some theophanic way, God is intending to express his presence amongst them. That will happen when the angel of the Lord comes to town. But the way it's pictured here is the idea that God is going to go fight as a mighty Gabor, a warrior amongst them, to defend his people and, of course, to destroy Assyria. All right, but if God's a consuming fire, which is one of Israel's earliest and most deeply ingrained pictures of God's presence, because that's what they dwelt with for a year at the base of Sinai while he's resting on the summit in a thick cloud of smoke and billowing fire. So what has happened then that the inhabitants of Jerusalem have come to tremble and fear Yahweh?
Well, I mean, the purification.
He's separating the false Israel from the true Israel.
Okay, so a subplot that's working here, sure. What were you saying, Bobby?
They all been living an ungodly. They was all not worshiping him the way that he told them to.
So a motivation then behind why they fear this sense of trepidation and saying, or in acting afraid, and of course, trembling seizing the ungodly, because now his holiness is amongst them, and as you're saying, it's a purifying and refining source that obviously holds no bias against godly, ungodly, righteous, unrighteous, clean, unclean. But we go back to the chapters that came before this, Isaiah 30. Look, the name of the Lord is coming from far away. His anger is burning, heavy with smoke. His lips are full of fury. His tongue is like a consuming fire. These words, though, were spoken against Judah, and namely Jerusalem, for their concocted schemes in trying to find a way to mitigate this horrible thing of Assyria coming against them. So this frame, this pose, is God coming like the roaring lion to pounce on them. But now, seemingly, this is turned in the previous verses 1 through 13, against Assyria. But now, the inhabitants of Zion, God's holy city, are given pause to stop and reflect on who dwells in their midst. And this is their reaction. And for good reason, right? It causes them to evaluate the conduct of their character, who they are in his presence. And that, again, his actions in judgment and wrath are not biased when it comes to whoever is the guilty party. So talking about the one who lives righteously, the one who can dwell amongst the consuming fire, dwell with ever-burning flames in God's sacred presence. More or less the question that's often asked sometimes in the Psalter by David and others, like Psalm 24, who can dwell on the mountain of the Most High? So what we're seeing here becomes a picture of a new Zion, where in Isaiah chapter 2, the nations come to stream up to the summit of this place, where we have a picture also in Isaiah 4 that God dwells in the form of a pillar of cloud by day, fire by night. And it's inhabited by those who are freed from the love of money because they won't take bribes. And of course, their ears are deafened. Think of the pictures we had in the previous chapters of those whose eyes were blind, ears were deaf. They could not see or hear or respond in faith to truth. But now these people are the absolute antithesis to this. They are in every way untouched, unblemished by evil, because they do not listen to murderous plots, as is the case with the nobles of the city. They have shut their eyes against the evil schemes, not because they choose ignorance, but because they do not allow these things in their presence. And this too comes from places like Psalm 15. Again, another exilic or post-exilic writing. Lord, who can dwell in your tent? Notice the language at the bottom of this passage in Isaiah. What does he liken Jerusalem to? A tent, whose tent pegs will never be loosened. Who can live on your holy mountain? Echoing what will be said in Psalm 24. The one who lives blamelessly, practices righteousness, acknowledges the truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue, who does not harm his friend. Again, the divergence becomes a little bit more clear now that the true Israel are going to be those who have been transformed, that get to live in the one city where human civilization will exist and thrive after God is done quaking the nations to the ground. Those people will dwell on the heights. Now notice these words. His refuge will be the rocky fortresses, his food and water provided and assured. So what picture does that take you to? You got to speak up. Somebody said something. I heard it, but I didn't hear it. Words came out, but I didn't comprehend them. Okay, so there's some Eden here. Exodus. Yeah, because there they are. They're out in the wilderness, right? Rocky fortresses up on the mountain. If you got it, I have to give it to you first. But food provided, water assured, right? I mean, there they are, right at the base of Sinai, and here water comes busting out of rocks. God is raining manna down from heaven, and it was provided at his cosmic mountain there in Sinai. Again, this is a picture of God's new cosmic mountain at the end of the age. But even though this is the terminus end, it's not to say that an inauguration of this concept doesn't come much sooner in the prophetic landscape. To talk about their eyes seeing the king in his beauty. For their eyes to see the king, then the king must be where? With them. Exactly. Now, the words that we just read in some of the preceding verses about Lebanon, Bashan, Carmel, Sharon, all withering, wilting, fading away, basically. Now their eyes are open to a vast landscape in front of them. And do you think it continues to hold the same picture of this hellscape scenario, or do you think there's a chance that it may have been transformed by the transformative presence and nature of the majestic king that stands in front of them? Absolutely, of course. So this is the perfect king of chapter 11, chapter 32, which is not too far in the rearview mirror for us, with an almost certain allusion to the promised land that he is going to ultimately rekindle and replenish. Psalm 45, again, another exilic writing, speaks on this very theme. My heart is moved by a noble theme as I recite my verses to the king. Now, this is to the Davidic descendant, with Solomon most likely being in mind, but it takes on a far greater scope when he gets down to verses 6 and 7, when he says, your throne, God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of justice. You love righteousness, hate wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy more than your companions. So where does that come from? We don't have time to go into all the connections here and what feeds into what and gives rise to this measure of theological significance here. But certainly it helps shape up for us the idea of who this king is, and that apparently it's somewhat distinctive from Yahweh, but yet is all the same as Yahweh. So your mind will meditate on the past terror. What do you think the past terror is? Exactly. So what is the significance that's added then to these offices listed of accountant, tribute collector, the one who spied out our defenses? Well, let's work backwards. Obviously, Assyria would be sending out spies, right? People who need to test the vulnerabilities of the city by knowing where to go. After all, David had a really hard time conquering the fortress of the Jebusites. They had to go up a well shaft to get into the city, right? So the Assyrians are going to try to figure this out. And then, of course, you got people like the accountants, tribute collectors, those people who are come first to collect the money and, of course, to settle up the sum total and the debt, which now, since the days of Hezekiah's father, they've been on the hook for. And a kingdom can't thrive as long as money is always being bled out to some overlord in massive sums of tribute just to protect them from them, right? But now, after this past terror is gone, this is over with. So then Judah gets to keep what is hers, the prosperity that is made within her own means, or that she is being blessed with. You'll no longer see the barbarians. Who do you think those are? Exactly. So it's a complete reversal of what was pictured as a mode of judgment in chapter 28 when we got this first formula of a people whose speech is difficult to comprehend. Now, to remind us, in chapter 28, when we were talking about this, in chapter 28, we were speaking of those who inhabit Judah, hearing the words of those people like Isaiah and his contemporaries, speaking the covenant law of God, line after line, chord after chord, and it seems like strange speech to them because it's so foreign, as goes the concept of what they are being held accountable for and what they agreed to, as goes their ancestors. But it can also double as a picture of what you see with Assyria, people who speak a totally different language that would have to be interpreted for them. And we see that kind of becoming something a little similar here with respect to the idea of you not seeing the barbarians, those who speak a language difficult to comprehend, who stammer in a language that can't be understood, they're gone. They're gone. So hopefully what we get here is that God has removed the existential threat. He has shown up. He has preserved his people. He has fought for them. He has preserved them. And now your eyes will see Jerusalem. First you see the king, then you see the vast land. Now their eyes are turned to the city. that has become not a bustling super center like is kind of pictured, or a super city, where all human civilization is going to funnel themselves into, but instead an open pasture, a tent that doesn't wander. The cosmic mountain where the Moadim, for those of you who are in our Torah class, hopefully you remember that, coming from the book of Leviticus. That's the translation of the phrase festival times. All of those feasts on the liturgical or religious calendar, the moments when the God of the cosmos and his covenant people, which now in Isaiah's text is more than just ethnic Israel. This is everyone who becomes part of his pasture, his flock, his covenant family. The cosmic mountain where the Moadim are observed, a place where permanent ingathering as the wandering exile now is over with. That's what Isaiah is trying to paint a picture of, is the established permanence of where they dwell, because they will set the tent up in Jerusalem, but its tent pegs will never be loosened. This nomadic people have finally found their place of rest. That's what they were supposed to be enjoying for these last 700 years, but it's what they've been squandering. To round out the chapter, for the majestic one, our Lord, will be there, a place of rivers and broad streams where ships that are rowed will not go, majestic vessels will not pass. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us. Your ropes are slack, they cannot hold the base of the mast or spread out the flag. Then abundant spoil will be divided, the lame will plunder it, and none there will say, I am sick. The people who dwell there will be forgiven their iniquity. This is a very weird sequence, right? I mean, because we're talking about a city that will have rivers coming up to it, but boats can't pass by it. Speaking now of God's character in this tripartite division of judge, lawgiver, king, but then an insult to somebody saying their ropes are slack, and then strangely moving over to say that those who were there aren't going to be sick. Well, let's try to make sense of this. So if Zion is pictured as a place where rivers are flowing to, but ships can't go there, then what might this symbolize? Let me try to help you. In this day and time, rivers are part of the major highway system of the ancient world, especially this particular area, that carry ships. And ships carry what? Not just people, but goods and cargo, things that you sell. Obviously, consider the days of Solomon, right, when he is sending ships to Ophir that bring in massive tonnage of gold amongst various other things to increase not only the opulence, but the wealth of this kingdom. But to say that they don't need ships to come there, but we have the beautification of this place, pictured a few verses earlier as a hellscape, now it's this vast land. What does this mean then? Do they need wealth to be wealthy? No. Can they sustain themselves without having to suckle off the wealth of the nations? Absolutely. This is a picture of God's measure of restoration. What's that?
Said it just a few verses ago.
Right, exactly. So he's just building on that, fleshing that out all the more. And why is this the case? Because God is our judge. But now when you think judge, you're probably thinking dude, black robes, sitting on a raised desk up in front of a courtroom. No, we're supposed to be thinking of the days of Samson, Othniel, the very first judge of Israel. Salvific deliverers who come and taunt Israel's enemies, and God uses them as the agent by which he will destroy whoever their enemies or captors are and bring revival, unification back to the people. Same thing with our king. One can say that somewhat resembles Saul, but how much more David, who as this messianic figure finally does what Saul could not, unifies the people, challenges their greatest foe at this moment, the Philistines, defeats their enemy when he is but a helpless boy, and beyond that, he expands their territorial holdings far beyond what they were originally granted. And our lawgiver, like Moses, the one who delivered them from Egypt. All of these have one thing in common. They save, they deliver, they lead into new Exodus-like moments, and that's what this is supposed to be seen as a picture of. So then, who is the "your" here in verse 23, who is the subject of this seeming insult? Your ropes are slack. They can't hold the base of a mast. We would have to go back to where was the last place where the second person pronoun was used. I'll help you. Verse 19. It's Judah. But then what do we make of the idea of their ship being in such disarray and so dysfunctional? Because here we've just got this scad of verses given to us about God beautifying Judah and Jerusalem Him coming to dwell amongst them, the people who are ideal for this place, who have clean hands and pure hearts. Why then does he seemingly resort back to calling them a dysfunctional ship who can't even hold up their own mast? That's a pitiful ship. Would you get on something like that? If you got to go sail across a massive body of water like a lake, would you sail on a ship where you watch the mast rock back and forth with the wind? You hear it creak and you wonder, can that thing even survive 10 minutes out of the harbor? Only a fool would do such a thing. So if Judah is such a pitiful ship, what does that say about them? Can they bring this hope as goes their forecasted future themselves? Of course not. Who are they going to have to rely on? Exactly. And because of that, then it can be said that none will say who live in this new Zion, I'm sick. The people who dwell there will be forgiven their iniquity. Because Zion becomes a place where neither sickness nor sin are found anywhere. So, any questions so far on chapter 33? Nothing? All right. 34. You nations, come here and listen. You peoples, pay attention. Let the earth and all that fills it hear, the world and all that comes from it. The Lord is angry with all the nations, furious with all their armies. He will set them apart for destruction, giving them over to slaughter. Their slain will be thrown out, and the stench of their corpses will rise. The mountains will flow with their blood. All the stars in the sky will dissolve. The sky will roll up like a scroll, and its stars will all wither, as leaves wither on the vine and foliage on the fig tree. There are many things I would love to just say about this junction where we're in. For those who might hold to the theory that there are multiple divisions to Isaiah, this is where many would agree that first Isaiah seemingly is drawing to its close and will come to its climax at the end of 39, and then we move to second Isaiah in 40 through 55. And this becomes a junction point in which we are seeing a lot of the themes that are readily available for us to purview in the first portion of Isaiah are intimately connected through these words to themes that become more of central focus in second and third Isaiah. I'm not saying that to advocate either theory or that theory. I'm just simply saying that's there. It's part of the scholarly discussion. But one thing we do see here, if we just move away the idea of a first and second and third Isaiah, this is a junction point that brings together many of these threads of talk and themes in the earlier portions all the way up to this moment, and is forecasting for us things that are going to be repeated in the future. But this is a common thing for Isaiah. Isaiah loves to do this. There's a reason why I start every lesson by reminding us this is a microcosm in chapters 1 through 12, because a lot of what is said here is going to be repeated in these two small chapters. And what we're seeing here is basically a rehashing of this, right? Because it starts with Judah and Jerusalem, then we look at the nations in their immediate vicinity, move to a cosmic judgment. What we've just seen is a lot of chapters now going back to focusing on Judah in this immediate context of their attempt to try to wriggle out of what God is going to force them into with respect to Assyria coming to confront them. But instead of us moving to the nations in their immediate vicinity, we're going to take a brief pause. We're going to go to what appears to be a cosmic level of judgment, or against all the nations, right? Because it goes from the nations in their backyard to all the nations across the known world. Here, in these brief verses we just read, we're going from Judah, Jerusalem, to the nations, and then we're going to round this chapter up by going back to talk about Edom. All right? So just try, as best you can, to keep that in mind. I just told you there what popped up in that black bubble. The Lord being angry with all the nations. So this sequence seemingly is now transitioned beyond the judgment of Judah by Assyria to the world at large. The fury he has reserved against Assyria is now going to just melt the nations in wrath. And look at the word pictures of verses 3 and 4 to really get a good idea of what that looks like. But before we get there, this feeds into, again, more post-exilic writing like Psalm 97, where the psalmist says, "The Lord reigns, let the earth rejoice. Let the many coasts and islands be glad. Clouds and total darkness surround him." How do you square that up? Be glad that the Lord reigns when we consider the idea that clouds and total darkness surround him. Here he is not pictured as the giver of life or the bringer of light. He is surrounded by all the things that are filled with nightmares, right? Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Fire goes before him and burns up his foes on every side. His lightning lights up the world. The earth sees and trembles. The mountains melt like wax at the presence of the Lord, and at the presence of the Lord of the whole earth. Again, not exactly mirroring what we see here in Isaiah, but definitely picking up that theme and running forward with it with respect to the idea of slain being thrown out, mountains flowing with their blood. Now, let me take a small little rabbit trail here, because again, this is where we're going to start to pick up a little bit more steam with respect to the idea of fleshing out Isaiah's eschatology. It's a very easy thing for us to look at the words like verse 4, stars in the sky dissolving, rolling up like a scroll, sky withering away, and see John in Revelation use those exact same words and have it touted to us by other teachers that that is literal. The stars in the sky will truly fall down from their orbits and come crashing into the earth. However, when we go back to the original context, and this is not the only place where a formula like this is used, but go directly to the verse above this, do we really expect that mountains will flow with the blood of human beings? No, that is poetic in nature. And so would be the idea of, say, Alpha Centauri truly falling out of its orbit, a massive star that's bigger than our own sun, of which millions of copies of our own planet can fit inside the bright yellow star that we orbit around. And if Alpha Centauri is bigger than that, and that thing crushed into the earth, there would be nothing left. Nothing left. So understand this as the poetic prose it is, and appreciate the fact that it's talking about something a little less grand than truly big balls of burning gas falling out of their orbits. And understanding in the ancient Near East, oftentimes these heavenly luminaries are talking about principates that rule in the unseen realm, or their human representatives, most often kings, priests, or both, either separate or combined into the same office. That all of these governmental structures in both the seen and unseen realms will be dissolved when this is all that's left. God and his new creation. All right. So moving beyond that, with the incorporation of cosmic language, it would seem to be a reference to the great and final day of the Lord. But it is seen in the judgments of singular nations as well. In fact, going back to the first reference of Babylon in Isaiah 13, he uses the very same words, indeed, talking about their judgment and final end. Indeed, the stars of the sky and its constellation will not give their light. When? When Babylon is destroyed. The sun will be darkened when it rises, and the moon will not shine. When? When Babylon is destroyed. I will punish the world for its evil, because Babylon in this sequence is considered to be the preeminent world power, as they have overthrown their Assyrian overlords and governed everything that Assyria once did, plus land beyond that reach. And wicked people for their iniquities. I will put an end to the pride of the arrogant and humiliate the insolence of tyrants when Babylon falls, not at the end of time. So moving beyond that, 5 through 11. When my sword has drunk its fill in the heavens, and it will then come down on Edom. Now, why is that? Here we just moved. This is so weird, right? In these preceding verses, we talked about God judging the nations. And when his sword has drunk its fill of blood from the nations, he's going to judge tiny little Edom. Why? Well, let's read on. And on the people I have set apart for destruction. The Lord's sword is covered with blood. It drips with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats and the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah. Bozrah is the capital of Edom, in case we weren't aware. A great slaughter in the land of Edom. The wild oxen will be struck down with them, and young bulls with the mighty bulls. Their land will be soaked with blood, and their soil will be saturated with fat. For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a time of paying back Edom for its hostility against Zion. Edom's streams will be turned into pitch, her soil into sulfur. Her land will become burning pitch. It will never go out, day or night. Its smoke will go up forever. It will be desolate from generation to generation. No one will pass through it forever and ever. Eagle owls and herons will possess it, and long-eared owls, ravens will dwell there. The Lord will stretch out a measuring line and a plumb line over her for her destruction and chaos. So, again, I ask the question, why is Edom marked for judgment after the nations have already been destroyed? Wouldn't she have been swallowed up with that? So this is where we have to stop, and we got to remember our Bible 101. So who is Edom? Who founded this people? Esau. Okay, who's Esau?
Brother Jacob.
Okay, so what was their deal? Why does Esau and Jacob seem to not like each other or their progeny after them?
Esau stole his birthright for a bowl of soup.
Okay, and after being tricked once, somehow he wasn't directly tricked, but because of what Jacob did with his father, man, that sealed the deal. And Esau's final words before his brother left for 20 years was, he's going to do what? He's going to kill him. He wants to kill his brother. Now, he doesn't really seem to have that propensity of holding a curse for endless amounts of years, because the next time these two brothers meet, it's a lot more joyous, right? Seems like Esau does what to Jacob? But does that carry on in the generations that follow between these two brothers? What happens when Israel comes out of Egypt and they need to pass by the borders of Edom? Not to come through there and inhabit the space for a time. It's not that unwelcome family guest that just comes in, takes their shoes off, immediately goes right to your fridge and cabinets and just starts rooting and pillaging around and says, hey, when I leave here next month, or something like that, they're like, look, if we take anything, we'll pay for whatever we take. Just please let us pass by. How does Edom meet that? They sent an army out there. That's right. They sent an army. We want you to know that if you step so much as a toenail across the line, we're cutting it off.
28 miles coming to the house like that.
And so this is the story between them, right? I mean, it leads to a time of conquest when David enters into Edom, and they put nearly every male to death under Joab, and they inhabit the place for endless generations after that, until finally Edom is able to rebel later on, several centuries later, in the era of the divided kingdom. And they are there to rejoice and even pitch in, lend aid to Nebuchadnezzar and his horde of Babylonians and other mercenaries who did not need the Edomites, but they want to join in on the fun. They want to dance around the burning sombrero. So the Lord's sword being covered with blood and fat. What kind of language is this? Notice the animals being used, and notice what is being taken from them, blood and fat.
Yeah.
Sacrificial language, that's right. So it's the language of Leviticus, and the fat portions of the animal belong to the Lord. So this is God's sacrifice, and He is the one orchestrating it. He is the one executing it, right? This all belongs exclusively to Him. But now we're talking about wild oxen. Wild oxen being included with the young bulls, the mighty bulls. So when we go back to that sacrificial language of Leviticus, what do you not find ever being used in any of the offerings where a bull might be appropriated? A wild oxen for sure. So you don't just go out there and take one who hasn't been brought in to pasture. This belongs to you. Wild oxen, and not saying that there are good reasons why they can't be, but we just note they are auspiciously absent from any of that talk in Leviticus about what's considered an appropriate sacrifice. But to say that the wild oxen, which are not used for sacrifice, along with the other animals that are fit for sacrifice, are all going to be included together, and they're all going to be destroyed. What does that become a picture of then? Nations. Okay, so yeah, we're moving beyond just the idea. It becomes transcendent beyond animals to people, but it also becomes a picture of all-consuming wrath.
God judged everybody.
Exactly. It's so if that's the case, then Edom becomes a picture of the nations. So now it starts to become eerily clear why we moved from nations in the beginning of this chapter down to one tiny little kingdom on the south by southeastern border of Judah. That, relative though they might be, they're seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of things that starts this chapter. But now they become a picture. And we've seen Isaiah do this before, have we not? When he uses nations, empires as archetypes of a much grander picture of the nations. His day of vengeance coming back to pay them back for what they did against Zion. And we've talked about their history already, but Obadiah is one prophet that picks up on this. He says his whole entire prophecy is against them. You, Edom, will be covered with shame and destroyed forever because of violence done to your brother Jacob. Or Amos, who says, the Lord says, I will not relent from punishing Edom for 3 crimes, even 4, because he pursued his brother with the sword. He did what their progenitor refused to go on to do when he had the chance. He stifled his compassion. His anger tore at him continually. He just would not let the grudge go, and he harbored his rage incessantly. And they wind up taking captives and selling them into slavery, committing the very crime of Jacob's own sons, right? And sadly, it was not used for good or that we have record of, as was the case with Joseph. So now notice what happens, the word picture of their land. Think of beautiful, crystal clear rivers running through your backyard. Now you go out there tomorrow, and all the greenery is nothing but dust, desert brown, and what was once life-giving sources like streams are rivers of tar flowing through your backyard. Add to that a volcano erupting in the background, and you got yourself a zombie apocalypse just brewing, right? It's the hellscape of hellscapes. And this is what they are being pictured as here, right? And so the question then becomes, what is the reason for this? But before we get to that, he goes on to talk about what will happen after this decimation comes through. And this is a picture that's used by more than one prophet and more than once by Isaiah. It talks about all these birds of a predatory nature, and not just birds, but other animals as well, that they will come to dwell there because all human presence, in fact, all traces of human existence is gone. And when the Lord stretches out his measuring line, a plumb line over her, that's to say this is the standard, right? The plumb line is the true measurement. He says this is for her destruction and chaos. Those words from Hebrew, the tohu wabohu, say that 10 times fast. That's the existence of the world prior to the Lord beginning to speak in Genesis 1 when he said, let there be light. It's the very state of the primordial creation that the Spirit is hovering over before light pierces the darkness, before land begins to come out from underneath the waves, covering it up, before vegetation sprouts, before lights are hung in the firmament, before man and creeping beast are crawling and walking on the face of the earth. This is what this is turned into, and it will fall not a centimeter short of that. But now here's the thing. Again, poetic prose. When this day finally comes, and presumably this will be at the hands of the Babylonians, if we're talking about literal history, to say that no one will ever pass through there again, that this place is going to continually burning like a perpetual fire without end, does not happen like that. It's just to say that when he speaks to the fact that they will be annihilated, they will be annihilated. To the point where it wasn't up until 2019 that the archaeological community actually were willing to come forth and say, we will stake the reputation we have in the circles of academia and state that we firmly believe that now Edom is a real place. That as the Bible has claimed for all these countless centuries, it indeed was a real kingdom. Because prior to that, they didn't really have anything outside of historical references that ever claimed the place or proved the place ever actually existed. They found no trace of it. So in some semblance, those words did come true. To round out this chapter, no nobles will be left to proclaim a king. All her princes will come to nothing. Her palaces will be overgrown with thorns. Her fortified cities with thistles and briars. She will become a dwelling place for jackals and abode for ostriches. The desert creatures will meet hyenas, and one wild goat will call to another. Indeed, the night birds will stay there and will find a resting place. Sand partridges will make their nests there. They will lay and hatch their eggs. They will gather their broods under the shadows. Indeed, the birds of prey will gather there, each with its mate. Search and read the scroll of the Lord. Not one of them will be missing. None of them will be lacking its mate, because he has ordered it by his mouth. He will gather them by his spirit. He has cast the lots for them. His hand allotted their portion with the measuring line. They will possess it forever. They will dwell in it from generation to generation. So to say that there's no king in this now devolved creation, where the untamed earth of what is pictured as outside the garden in the Genesis 1-2 scenario has now crept into the Eden that is Edom in this picture. That what was growing up outside that garden has infiltrated this garden and has now overtaken it such that the entire kingdom is overrun with this picture of chaos, thistles and thorns, where man has to scratch a living from the rocks, pull his food from the thorns, wrestle it away from the ground, and die in complete, total misery. And this is what has become of the place where the relatives of Abraham dwelt, where God once told the descendants of Jacob, you will not go and provoke Edom to war. I have given them that land. It is theirs by my sovereign decree, as much as Canaan is yours. So Edom, Mount Seir, is theirs. And as he has given Judah over to destruction, so will he Edom for their crimes. Skipping to the bottom. What is meant by the idea of search the scroll of the Lord? Perhaps the scroll is maybe the spoken words of Yahweh, right? But to say that it's the Torah, I mean, search the scroll of the Lord in the sense of the Torah and find what? Because he goes on to say, search the scroll, because there you will find that none of them will be missing. Them is all of these birds, these jackals, these hyenas and wild goats that he promises are going to come and occupy the territory of a once great Edom that has now been decimated to complete ruin. So it's not very obviously clear what exactly is being meant here. Maybe it's in the vein of chapters 8 and 29, in the sense of him talking about seal up the document, roll up the scroll, save it for a generation who is going to listen. It seems like Isaiah in different places has put a heavy emphasis on the idea of him actually writing down what he has said, and that what he has preached out loud to the people is being preserved for posterity's sake, so that someday a faithful generation will arise from the ruin and ash heap of this faithless one and carry on the legacy of their covenant agreement with God. But now moving beyond that, when he's talking about the Spirit gathering them, the them again being these animals, what movement do you remember in the stories of Scripture where God brings animals to one rallying point on the map? But that was a story of God's judgment too, as this is. But that was with the idea of redemption and salvation in the backdrop, right? That God is going to corral an Eden inside a floating wooden box to pour it out on a newly renovated earth on the other side of the flood. There is no promise of hope here for God resurrecting an Edom and giving them this people their land back. When he says they will possess it, it's the animals, not the people. They will occupy it from generation to generation. This goes back from Isaiah 8 and 29 for the references we talked about earlier. All right, 35. We've got 11 minutes, but 10 verses. So a verse a minute, right? The wilderness and the dry land will be glad. Now, we just got done reading about the hellscape of what Eden will become, or Edom will become. Now we get to this. The wilderness and the dry land will be glad. The desert will rejoice and blossom like a wildflower. It will blossom abundantly. It will also rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. So strengthen the weak hands, steady the feeble knees. Say to the cowardly, be strong and do not fear. Here is your God. Vengeance is coming. God's retribution is coming. He will save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will sing for joy. For water will gush in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The parched ground will become a pool, and the thirsty land springs. In the haunt of jackals, in their layers, there will be grass, reeds, and papyrus. So, deserts blooming. Water's got to flow for it to bloom, right? Because vegetation just doesn't pop out all magic-like. So what picture do we draw that from? The idea of deserts being aflush with water. Okay, so there's that. We've got that picture in other places in Isaiah. But that too, all of those pictures seem to feed off the same motif that carries us way back to a story in Israel's origin of, again, water flowing in the desert. Where do we find that?
In the Exodus.
Exactly. So this is one of those great stakeholders in the entirety of the massive Isaiah corpus where we can look back to and say, this is what he's talking about. As goes the fact near annihilation and exile is going to come. But when it's all said and done, the new age that dawns after that period of darkness is going to be an entirely new exodus for God's people. An exodus in such great, grand opulence that it will never need to be repeated again, because it will be the final terminal measure of their salvation, their complete redemption. So this hellscape that he just described is now going to become a flush with life-giving water such that the desert will blossom and bloom, become an oasis. There's no spot left on the map where sand lurches. It goes back to Exodus 17, as goes that picture of water coming from the rock. Glory of Lebanon, splendor of Carmel and Sharon. Didn't we just see these words all sandwiched together in one verse just a couple of slides ago? The situation of chapter 33, as the world is judged, is now reversed. And the barren earth has come to life. We remember that, right? He said the land mourns, withers. Lebanon is ashamed. Sharon a desert. Bashan and Carmel, they all shake off their withering, dying leaves, but now bustling with life once again. They will see the glory of the Lord and the splendor of our God. Kabod, for glory here, that's the inherent value of Yahweh. So notice that. This has been descriptive of them up to this point, that they refuse and fail to see the inherent value of the God that they serve. They fail to ascribe to the Holy One of Israel the glory that is His. They have demanded to be taken off the path. They want to be rid of the Holy One of Israel. But now, with truly opened eyes, unstopped ears, and transformed hearts, they will see the glory, His true inherent value, not just brilliant, dazzling, shining light. They will appreciate Him for all of His worth. An almost incomprehensible concept in and of itself. And the splendor or outward majesty, that's the glory and light of our God. The very thing that Moses is striving to try to see when he is hid in the cleft of the rock up on the mountain. So now, just like Moses got a chance to glimpse it, they will see it in full view in front of them. Now, consider this. If we're talking about the Exodus story and them leaving out of Egypt and out in the barren wilderness, but God is bringing life-giving water and food to them there, but notice that's not the end of the story. The end of the Exodus is them in what? The promised. Who takes them in there? Not Moses. Joshua, that's right. So when we read these words, say to the cowardly, be strong, do not fear. Who do you remember hearing that? Have I not said to you, be strong and of a good courage? Who was on the receiving end of that? Joshua. So now we're sandwiching these two stories together. It's not only a new Exodus, but it's a whole new conquest period in and of itself as the terminal end of this, right? He goes on to say, He will save you. Again, following the Exodus paradigm that much further. But the eyes of the blind being opened, the ears of the deaf being unstopped, the lame leaping like deer, the tongues of the mute singing for joy. So the presence of disease will be vanquished because the arrival of Yahweh's kingdom and His new Exodus from exile is commencing. But where do you see this playing out in real space and time? In fact, there was a guy who actually sent a small band of inquirers to this fella, and he said, hey, I got to know. Are you the one that we're looking for, or do we need to wait for someone else? And this guy said, you know, I want you to go back and I want you to tell that when asking this question. The very thing that your eyes have seen and your ears have heard. That the eyes of the blind are open, the ears of the deaf are unstopped. The lame leap like deer. He's pulling right from the words of Isaiah. Just as much as John would when he would answer the people who asked, who are you? Are you Elijah? Jeremiah, come back. Are you that prophet? Are you Messiah? No. Who are you? From Isaiah 40. The voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the paths of the Lord. Jesus returns the favor in kind, answers right from Isaiah. Because who is the one who brings this? It's the King who rules with not only majesty and glory, but righteousness and justice as His belt wrapped around Him. The bringer of the Spirit from Isaiah 11, who rules in Isaiah 32 and Isaiah 9 over all the nations. He's the one who arrays this magnificent feast in Isaiah 25 on the mountain of His glory, where He removes the shroud of death that embarrasses and covers all the nations. And now the sign of the coming of His kingdom, apparently, is this very thing. But it's coupled with the idea, we go back to Isaiah 29. On that day, the deaf will hear the words of a document, and out of the deep darkness, the eyes of the blind will see. So he's just echoing that verbiage over again. But then water will gush in the wilderness, streams in the desert, parched ground will become a pool, the thirsty land springs. And even in the haunt of jackals, their lairs where no animal would willingly go into, no unsuspecting or no suspecting traveler would dare let their foot creep into that layer, because you're probably not going to come out alive on the other end of this. But yet, even in a place like that where death abounds, here, the very imagery of life, grass, reeds, papyrus. Reeds and papyrus being the very things that grow along the banks of what? The Nile. So now we're bringing all of creation into it. It's not just the idea of, say, Eden as one spot on the map, but even the Nile brought into this as well. Maybe that's what's inspiring Moses in writing what he does in Genesis about Eden's geographic territory that it reached to, right? All that to simply say, it raises a question then. If we can so easily attach Jesus to verses 5 through the beginning of 6, then are we really expecting a literal fulfillment of the end of verse 6 to be what comes in the age after this? Are we waiting for literal vegetation to go popping up in the desert, or springs of water where there were none, to be a sign of God's favor and blessing upon the earth? I'm not saying there's not going to be a relief of the curse once he returns. I'm just simply saying all of these continue to serve as word pictures of what? A new Exodus. Living water, exactly. Man, it's all interwoven in the Gospels, right? Last week we talked about the concept of Jesus on that mountain where he's transfigured in Luke 9, and Moses and Elijah, the two people who stood in God's presence on Mount Sinai. Exodus pictures abound, and they ask him about his Exodus he's about to start in Jerusalem. So this concept of life coming to barren landscape is a place where life penetrates death in the barren heart that's separated from God. So let's read these last verses and see if we can wrap it up. A road will be there and a way. It will be called the Holy Way. The unclean will not travel on it, but it will be for the one who walks the path. Fools will not wander on it. There will be no lion there, and no vicious beast will go up on it. They will not be found there, but the redeemed, they will walk on it. The ransom of the Lord will return and come to Zion with singing, crowned with unending joy. Joy and gladness will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee. So, a road traveling through this new wilderness that's been turned into a garden, leading to Zion, because it's the road they travel on. This new barren landscape that's now become a bustling garden almost is not the terminal end of this. Zion, the city of God, the city that rises above the ash heap of what's left behind, and now surrounded by this magnificent foliage, is the place where they go, the city of Yahweh. But notice that those who are not fit for sacred space, that's what's meant by unclean. This is not to simply say you're generic sinner. It's to say that the one who retains their impurity. Think of the context of Numbers 19. The water of cleansing that comes from the ashes of the red heifer, mixed in with the water in the clean clay jar. Then they've touched a dead body, they are unclean. If not sprinkled with that water on days 3 and 7, they retain their uncleanness perpetually. They are not welcome back into the community of God's faithful ever again. Those people, and yes, we could say tainted with the death of their sin, are not suitable for sacred space. And if we go back to the concept of what Zion is in Isaiah 2, Isaiah 4, the whole mountain's summit is sacred space. Not just a tiny little space where two 15-foot cherubim made out of olive wood trees overshadow a golden gilded box. It's the whole entire plateau, sacred space. They will not be traveling it, but those who walk the path. Where did we see that word, the path, before? Well, remember chapter 30, when they're proclaiming, get out of the way, leave the pathway, rid us of the Holy One of Israel. Right? And of course, that goes back to Moses' words in Deuteronomy. What's that? They want to get off the path, but those who now want to be on the path are those who will travel the way of the Holy One to Zion. And we can also see this tangibly interworking with Isaiah 29 as well, but for the sake of time, I'll go on. No lion will be there, no vicious beast. And why is that? Because God uses lions a lot as judgmental form throughout the Scriptures. But, of course, these are the probably gravest existential threat. I mean, granted, you can have a band of marauders come and attempt to try to assail you, but if you've got weapons, a means of defending yourself and chasing them away, maybe you survive that encounter. But when lions come roaring down the hillside out of the crags and rocks on the sides of the slope that surround your path, probably not a good chance you're going to come out of that alive, or with very much of what you traveled there with before that lion winds up getting its fill and going away. But there will be no threat. No threat whatsoever, and no fear of God's judgment in any form coming against these people. Why? Because that time has passed. It has come. It is gone. And the redeemed now walk on this path. Right? Now, I'm always on to you guys about properly defining biblical terms and not seeing the Old Testament through a New Testament lens. So when we read the redeemed will walk on that, you and I are thinking, yeah, the people who follow Jesus as Lord and Savior. You're right, but we don't get there from here by one foul or one big jump. We understand how the Bible defines these words, ransomed and redeemed. This comes from places like Leviticus 25, Numbers 5, 35, Deuteronomy 19. And in all of these passages, we're talking about what happens when a family member cannot receive a particular blessing or benefit. In other words, if a field is sold, but then it's to be redeemed, but that money can't be given directly over to the family because maybe all the family members are dead, then it has to be given to a priest. That money, compensation, has to go somewhere, so the priest then stands in for the family. Or what happens if someone kills a family member of mine? If they did so in cold-blooded murder, then I'm supposed to go out and avenge them. It's not an option. The expectation is I go out, hunt that person down, and kill them. Life for life. For the innocent party that was slain, I stand in their stead, and I avenge their blood on the one that took their life. Or if I die and produce no heir after me, then my brother is expected to stand in for me and marry my widow, and their firstborn son will be my son, not my brother's son. All of these are substitutional in basis. That's the idea, is that someone has to stand in the gap and do this sacred duty. It is a huge measure of immense shame if one refuses this. We see that somewhat in the book of Ruth playing out. And we know that no one would dare usurp the one who has the right to do this. In all of this, it's, I think, pretty clear that the only way, from the context and picture of the rickety, shaky mast that is the dysfunctional ship of Judah and can't possibly achieve this extraordinarily extravagant outcome that he is forecasting for them of a vast landscape, their king dwelling amongst them, and a renewed creation, a barren landscape turned into a bustling, garden-esque-like atmosphere, that God is the only one who can redeem them. And he will let no one do that for him. He will stand in the gap as their substitute. And we understand from the picture of the servant that comes in Isaiah 53, he will be the one to take the full brunt of all the wrath that is rightly theirs, so that they, instead of that, can have this because of his mercy and goodness. So we are now at the end of this picture, this corridor of many passages talking about what's going to come on the heels of this when this plays out in real space and time. When God finally takes the foolishness, which they think is their wisdom, and turns it into what it's always been in front of their very eyes, to manifest himself as being the one who was always wise, but yet they refuse to listen. And how that works out for them in the end.